The old man's hands were shaking. That was the first thing Daniel Mercer noticed. Not the medals, not the coat, not the long line of impatient shoppers stretching behind him like a river that had somewhere else to be. Just the hands. Two thin, weathered hands trembling over the pocket of a faded navy blue coat, searching for something that was not there, or perhaps searching for something that had never been enough to begin with. The fluorescent lights of the grocery store hummed overhead with the indifference of machines, and the world inside that store kept moving the way the world always keeps moving, forward, forward, always forward, while one old man stood completely still at register 7 and quietly ran out of options. Daniel had come in for coffee and bread. He was not a man who lingered in grocery stores. 22 years as a United States Marine had given him the habit of moving through spaces with economy and purpose, taking what was needed and nothing more, and he had been 3 steps from the exit when Rex stopped walking. Rex was a Belgian Malinois, 9 years old, with a muzzle gone silver and eyes the color of late afternoon sun, and he had been trained over the course of his working life to notice what human beings overlooked. He was retired now, the same as Daniel, but retirement had not changed what he was made of, and when Rex stopped and turned his head toward register 7, Daniel stopped too. Because in all the years they had worked and lived and survived together, Daniel had never once regretted following that dog's attention. The old man was perhaps 90 years old, perhaps older. It was the kind of age that stops being a number and becomes instead a landscape, something vast and worn and full of weather. He was thin inside his coat, thin in the way that speaks not of choice, but of years, and his white hair was combed with the careful precision of a man who had not forgotten how to carry himself, even when carrying himself had become the hardest thing he did each day. On the chest of his coat, pinned with deliberate and loving care, were 3 medals, a silver star, a Purple Heart, and one that hit Daniel somewhere behind the sternum like a closed fist, the Navy Cross, the second highest military honor the Navy could place in the hands of a living man. And this man, this quiet and dignified and absolutely unbowed old man, had unpinned the Navy Cross from his chest and set it on the conveyor belt beside a carton of eggs, a small block of cheese, 1 loaf of bread, and a single can of soup. He had placed it there the way a man places the last thing he has, gently, without drama, with the exhausted grace of someone who has already grieved the moment before it arrived. The cashier was young, maybe 20, and she was not unkind. She was simply unprepared for the specific weight of what she was looking at. She said softly, "Sir, I'm sorry, but I can't accept this. It's not something our system can process."
The old man looked at her with eyes that had seen things she would never see, and he said in a voice that was still steady, still clear, still his, "It belonged to my country once. I imagine it still carries some value." Daniel was already moving. There was no gap between the seeing and the doing. There never had been in his life, and he did not expect that to change now. And he was standing beside the old man before the cashier could speak again, placing his own items on the belt, reaching past the old man quietly and pressing his card to the reader. "I've got this," he said, not loudly, not with performance, just the words, offered the way one man offers another man a hand across a distance that pride has made very wide. The old man turned and looked at him, and in that look was everything, gratitude and resistance, and the particular anguish of a man who had spent 90 years being the one who helped and never the one who was helped, and who found that the reversal of that order was harder than anything the Navy had ever asked of him. His name was Harold Eugene Watts. He had been born in the summer of 1934 in Chesapeake, Virginia, the 3rd son of a tobacco farmer who worked from before dawn and a school teacher who read aloud to her children every night and told them the world was larger than anything visible from their front porch and that they owed it to themselves to find out how large. Harold believed her. At 17, he walked into a Navy recruitment office with a letter his mother had written and a quiet certainty in his chest that was larger than his frame suggested. He became a Navy SEAL when the program was so new and so classified that most Americans had never heard the name. He served in Korea in the bitter cold of a war that history would later call forgotten, though nothing about it was forgotten by the men who fought it. He served in the waters off Cuba in October of 1962 during the week when the world held its breath and nuclear war stood close enough to cast a shadow, and Harold and men like him moved through that shadow in the dark and did what needed to be done and came home without speaking of it. He served in Vietnam twice, in operations whose names still carried classification markings that would outlive him, moving through jungle and river darkness with the precision and the loneliness of a man doing necessary things that he could never fully explain to anyone who had not been there beside him. He came home each time quietly, the way men of his generation came home, without ceremony, without demand, folding his uniform into the back of the closet and stepping back into ordinary life as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, because that was the agreement, unspoken and absolute, that men like Harold had made with themselves and with their country. He had married Eleanor in 1962 in a small church outside Norfolk on a Saturday in June when the air smelled of honeysuckle and the light came through the windows in long golden bars, and Harold stood at the altar in his dress whites and felt, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, completely unafraid. Eleanor was the one person to whom he had never needed to explain anything. She understood him the way certain rare people understand each other, not through effort, but through some deeper alignment, as though they had been made from the same material and had simply found their way back to each other across the distance of separate childhoods. They had one son, James, who grew up watching his father with the careful reverence of a child who senses the size of something he cannot yet name. Eleanor died 11 years ago in the spring in a hospital room where Harold sat beside her and held her hand and did not look away. James died 8 years ago on a rain-soaked highway outside Richmond in the kind of accident that has no explanation and offers no comfort. And after that, Harold came home to apartment 304 on the third floor of a quiet building on Mercer Street and closed the door and learned, slowly and without assistance, how to be alone in a way that went far deeper than the physical fact of solitude. In the parking lot, Harold tried to give the money back. He reached into his coat, and Daniel shook his head once, gently but without room for negotiation, and Harold stood very straight and said, "I don't accept charity. I never have." Daniel looked at him steadily and said, "Neither do I, and this isn't charity. This is one serviceman recognizing another. That's all this is." The word serviceman moved through Harold in a way that was visible, a nearly imperceptible shift, the way a very old door moves when someone who knows its weight leans against it correctly for the first time. And then Rex stepped forward, because Rex always knew when to step forward, and pressed his silver muzzle gently into Harold's trembling hand. And Harold looked down at the dog, and his eyes changed in the way that eyes change when something that has been held for a very long time is finally carefully set down. Daniel drove him home. Harold did not resist. 6 blocks, 3rd floor, apartment 304. And when Harold opened the door and Daniel followed him inside and stood in the center of that small room, the apartment told its story in the way that spaces tell stories, without words, without apology, simply by being what they were. The furniture was old and sparse, a recliner near the window with a long strip of electrical tape holding one arm together, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, only one of which showed the wear of regular use. On the walls were photographs arranged with the care of a man who has lost the people in them but cannot lose the photographs. A young Harold in navy whites with a stillness in his posture that the camera had somehow understood. A wedding portrait, a boy's school picture faded to the soft, uncertain colors of old paper.
A group of men standing in jungle shadow who looked at the camera the way men look when they know where they have been and cannot say. On the kitchen counter was a collection of envelopes sorted into a careful row, and the words "Final Notice" were on 3 of them, and Daniel did not need to look closely to understand what they meant. The kitchen shelves held a few cans, some crackers, a jar of instant coffee, and 1 apple in a bowl on the counter, placed there with the particular care that a person places the last of something they are trying to make last. They sat for 2 hours. They talked the way veterans talk when they have finally found each other across the long distance of civilian life. Slowly, with silences between them that needed no filling, with the occasional dry humor that men who have faced real darkness use as a kind of shorthand between themselves. Harold talked about Eleanor. He talked about James briefly, in the careful, flat voice of someone who has learned to carry a thing without letting it break open in company. He talked about a morning in the winter of 1968 off the coast of North Vietnam, speaking the facts quietly and without decoration, and his hands moved differently while he spoke, and Daniel listened with everything he had, and said very little, and understood that listening was what was needed, and gave it completely. Rex lay across Harold's feet for the full 2 hours, and Harold's hand rested on the dog's back and did not move, and that hand, which had been shaking in the grocery store, was perfectly still. That evening, Daniel sat in his truck below apartment 304 and made 4 phone calls. Tommy O'Coffer, former Marine, contractor in Roanoke, who said after a silence, "Tell me when and I'll be there." Grace Tillman, retired Army nurse who organized veterans support through her church, who said, "Saturday morning, tell me what he needs." Bill Hendricks, 2 tours alongside Daniel, now working in the county offices, who said, "I'll pull his file in the morning. There are benefits he's probably never touched." And Sandra Watts, Harold's daughter-in-law, James's widow, who went quiet on the phone when Daniel said Harold's name, and then said in a voice that had come slightly undone at the edges, "I didn't know it had gotten this far. He told me he was fine. He's been telling everyone he's fine for 8 years." She came on Sunday with her 2 grandchildren, Harold's great-grandchildren. And the older one was a boy of 15 named James. And when Harold saw him standing in the doorway of apartment 304, he put his hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "You look just like your grandfather." And the boy said quietly, "Mom tells me that all the time." And Harold could not speak for a moment, and the room was very still, and nobody needed to fill that stillness with anything at all. Tommy came with his crew and fixed the window that had been letting in the October cold, and the faucet that had been leaking, and the light in the hallway that had been flickering for months. Grace came Saturday with her church group, and groceries enough to fill every shelf, and she sat with Harold at his kitchen table and talked about Eleanor without flinching and without rushing, and Harold talked back in a way he had not talked to anyone in years. Bill worked through the county veterans office and found what he had expected to find, that Harold had never filed for several benefits he had earned completely and that had gone unclaimed for years because Harold Watts had never once believed himself to be the kind of man who needed them. The paperwork was filed, and when the approvals came, they were not a fortune, but they were enough to silence the envelopes on the counter, enough to replace the taped recliner, enough to make sure the shelf with the single apple would not be empty again. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening, Daniel came back and found Harold sitting in the new recliner with the late October light coming through the window and falling across the wall where Grace's husband had built and mounted a small display case, and the 3 medals were inside it, the Silver Star and the Purple Heart and the Navy Cross, and the light touched them in a way that seemed intentional, the way light sometimes falls on things that have earned it. Harold looked at the medals for a long while and then said, I almost traded them for eggs." Daniel said, "I know." Harold was quiet for a moment and then said, "I spent 50 years believing the hardest thing a man could do was walk into the dark without knowing what was waiting on the other side." He paused, and in the pause was everything he had ever carried. Turns out, the hardest thing is opening a door and letting someone in. Daniel did not say anything. He sat with those words the way they deserved to be sat with, without hurry and without addition. And Rex lay between the two men in the golden light, and the room was quiet in the way rooms become quiet when they are finally, after a long time, full. There are men and women in this country who gave everything during the years that defined them, and who grew old in the quiet spaces between the moments the world chooses to remember. They live on third floors of ordinary buildings, on ordinary streets in every town across this land. They wake before dawn for the force of habit. They fold their blankets with the precision the military put into their hands, and that time never fully removed. They walk to small kitchens where the shelves are not always full, and they do not speak of it, because speaking of it was never part of who they chose to be. And sometimes they stand at a register in an ordinary grocery store and place the last heavy and irreplaceable thing they own on a conveyor belt, and the world around them keeps moving, because the world is busy, and the world does not always know how to see what is standing right in front of it. But sometimes someone stops, and a dog lifts his silver head, and one word, serviceman, opens a door that pride had locked for years. And a man who once moved through enemy darkness on the other side of the world is reminded, quietly and without ceremony, that his country has not forgotten him, that the loyalty he gave so completely for so many years is still alive in the world, still moving through it, still capable of arriving at apartment 304 on a Thursday evening with a full shelf and a mounted medal case and a boy named James who looks just like his grandfather. That is where the real heroism lives, not only in the medals on the wall, as earned and as beautiful as they are, but in the ordinary and unhesitating decision to stop, to see, and to stay. If this story moved something in you, please subscribe to this channel before you leave. The 11th Hour Last Words is here for stories like this one, for the quiet heroes and the faithful and the ones who gave their best years and never asked for anything in return. Subscribe now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, because the 11th hour arrives before any of us are ready, and the words that matter most are the ones we speak while there is still time.